Welcome to An Interview in History. Imagine a podcast that serves as a bridge across time, connecting listeners to the voices of history's most impactful figures. Each episode is a deep dive into the lives and legacies of these individuals, exploring not just their well-documented achievements, but also uncovering lesser-known facts that shaped their contributions to our world. From scientists who unlocked the mysteries of the universe to activists who fought for social change, each story is a testament to the indelible mark they left on society. This journey through history will not only educate, but also inspire listeners to appreciate the intricate tapestry of human progress. I'm your host, Steve Burig, and this week we're talking with Charles Augustus Lindbergh, who was an American aviator, author, and military officer. On May 20th through the 21st, 1927, he made the first non-stop flight from New York City to Paris, a distance of 3,600 miles, flying alone for 33 and a half hours in the first solo transatlantic flight. His aircraft, the Spirit of St. Louis, was designed to compete for the $25,000 Orteig Prize for the first flight between the two cities, and also set the record at the time for the furthest non-stop, non-refueled flight. This interview takes place on December 18th, 1973. Mr. Lindbergh, thank you for joining us. Let's start with your family background. Could you tell us about your parents and upbringing?
Of course. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, on February 4th, 1902, and spent most of my childhood in Little Falls, Minnesota, and Washington, D.C. I was the only child of Charles August Lindbergh, who had emigrated from Sweden to Melrose, Minnesota as an infant, and Evangeline Lodgeland Lindbergh of Detroit. I had three elder paternal half-sisters, Lillian, Edith, and Ava. My father, Charles, was a U.S. congressman from Minnesota, and my mother, Evangeline, was a teacher. Both were highly principled individuals who valued education and hard work. My parents separated when I was 7 years old, and I lived with my mother. She instilled in me a love for learning and a sense of independence.
What was your schooling like?
I attended various schools, as my mother moved frequently for work. Basically, I attended more than a dozen other schools from Washington, D.C. to California during my childhood and teenage years, none for more than 2 years, including the Force School and Sidewell Friends School while living in Washington with my father, and Redondo Union High School in Redondo Beach, California, while living there with my mother. Although I enrolled in the College of Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in late 1920, but I dropped out in the middle of my sophomore year. My real education came from hands-on experience, particularly in aviation.
Speaking of aviation, how did your interest in flying begin?
It was a gradual fascination from an early age. I had an interest in the mechanics of motorized transportation, including my family's Saxon 6 automobile, and later my Excelsior motorbike. By the time I started college as a mechanical engineering student, I had also become fascinated with flying, though I had never been close enough to a plane to touch it. After quitting college, I enrolled at the Nebraska Aircraft Corporation's flying school in Lincoln and flew for the first time on April 9th as a passenger in a 2-seat Lincoln Standard Turbout biplane trailer piloted by Otto Timm. A few days later, I took my first formal flying lesson in that same aircraft. Although I was never permitted to solo because I could not afford to post the requisite damage bond. To gain flight experience and earn money for further instruction, I left Lincoln in June to spend the next few months barnstorming across Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana as a wing walker and parachutist. I also briefly worked as an airplane mechanic at the Billings, Montana Municipal Airport. I eventually trained as a pilot and became an airmail carrier, which honed my skills for long, solitary flights.
I understand that early in your flying career you transported some people around, including your father.
Why, yes, that's true. I'm surprised how deeply you've gone into my history. I bought a World War I surplus Curtiss JN-4 Jenny biplane for $500, though by then I had not touched an airplane in more than 6 months. I had already secretly decided that I was ready to take the air by myself. After a half-hour of dual time with a pilot who was visiting the field, I flew solo for the first time in the Jenny. After spending another week or so at the field to practice, thereby acquiring 5 hours of pilot and command time, I took off from Montgomery, Alabama, some 140 miles to the west for my first solo cross-country flight. I went on to spend much of the remainder of 1923 engaged in almost non-stop barnstorming under the name Daredevil Lindbergh. This time, flying on my own ship as the pilot. A few weeks after leaving Americus, I made my first night flight near Lake Village, Arkansas. Well, while I was barnstorming in Lone Rock, Wisconsin on 2 occasions, I flew a local physician across the Wisconsin River to emergency calls that were otherwise unreachable because of flooding. I broke my propeller several times while landing, and on June 1923, I was grounded for a week when I ran into a ditch in Glencoe, Minnesota, while flying my father, then running for the U.S. Senate, to a campaign stop. In October, in Iowa, I sold it to a flying student. I returned to Lincoln by train, where I joined Leon Klink and continued to barnstorm through the South for the next few months in Klink's Curtiss JN-4C Canuck. I also cracked up this airplane once my engine failed shortly after takeoff in Pensacola, Florida, but I managed to repair the damage myself. Now let's talk about your airmail carrier experience. Well, I was hired by Robertson Aircraft Corporation, where I had been working as a flight instructor to lay out and then serve as a chief pilot for the newly designated 278-mile contract air mail route to provide service between St. Louis and Chicago, with intermediate stops in Springfield and Peoria, Illinois. Myself and 3 other RAC pilots flew the mail in a fleet of 4 modified war surplus de Havilland DH-4s. I executed the United States Post Office Department's oath of mail messengers, and 2 days later I opened service on the new route. On 2 occasions, combination of bad weather, equipment failure, and fuel exhaustion forced me to bail out on night approach to Chicago. Both times, I reached the ground without serious injury. In mid-February, I left for San Diego, California to oversee design and construction of the Spirit of St. Louis. Your solo transatlantic flight in 1927 made history. How'd you prepare for it? Preparation was key. I designed the Spirit of St. Louis with simplicity in mind, no frills, just what was necessary for the 33-hour journey from New York to Paris. I slept little before the flight, as there was much to finalize. The flight itself was grueling, but the success was a testament to determination and innovation. In the early morning of Friday, May 20th, 1927, I took off from Roosevelt Field in Long Island. My destination was about 7 miles outside Paris. It rained the morning of my takeoff, but as the plane was wheeled into position on the runway, the rain ceased, and light began to break through the low-hanging clouds. A crowd, described as several thousand, assembled to see me off. At 8:52 a.m., an hour after takeoff, I was flying at an altitude of 500 feet over Rhode Island, following an uneventful passage, aside for some turbulence over Long Island Sound in Connecticut. To keep my mind clear, I descended and flew at only 10 feet above the water's surface. Because I flew through several time zones, dawn came earlier, at around 2:52 a.m. I began to hallucinate about 2 hours later. At this point in the flight, I continually fell asleep, awakening seconds, possibly minutes later. But after flying for hours in or above the fog, the weather finally began to clear. At 7:52 a.m. marked 24 hours in the air, and I did not feel as tired by this point. Around 9:52 a.m. New York time, or 27 hours after I left Roosevelt Field, I saw porpoises and fishing boats, a sign that I had reached the other side of the Atlantic. I circled and flew closely, but no fishermen appeared on the boat decks, although I did see a face watching from a porthole. Dingle Bay in County Kerry of southwest Ireland was the first European land that I encountered. I veered to get a better look and consulted my charts, identifying it as the southern tip of Ireland. The local time in Ireland was 3 p.m. Flying over Dingle Bay, the Spirit was 2.5 hours ahead of schedule and less than 3 miles off course. I had navigated almost precisely to the coastal point I had marked on my chart. I wanted to reach the French coast in daylight, so I increased my speed to 110 miles per hour. The English coast appeared ahead of me, and I was now wide awake. Over 33.5 hours of the flight, the aircraft fought icing, flew blind through fog for several hours, and I navigated only by dead reckoning. I was fortunate that the winds over the Atlantic canceled out each other, giving me zero wind drift, and thus accurate navigation during the long flight over featureless ocean. On arriving at Paris, I circled the Eiffel Tower before flying to the airfield. I flew over the crowd at Le Bourget Aerodrome at 10:16 and landed at 10:22 p.m. on Saturday, May 21st, on the far side of the field and nearly half a mile from the crowd. The story of your flight is amazing. What was it like landing in Paris to such a crowd? The airfield was not marked on my map, and I knew only that it was some 7 miles northeast of the city. I initially mistook it for some large industrial complex because of the bright lights spreading out in all directions. In fact, the headlights of tens of thousands of spectators' cars caught the largest traffic jam in Paris history in their attempt to be present for my landing. It was all overwhelming. I wasn't prepared for the scale of the reception. It was a global phenomenon, and I suddenly found myself thrust into the spotlight. Now, you married Anne Morrow in 1929. How did you meet her? I met Anne while visiting her family. Her father, Dwight Morrow, was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, and I was there on a goodwill tour. Anne was intelligent, adventurous, and quickly became my partner in aviation and life. Did you and Anne have children? Yes, we had 6 children. They brought joy to our lives, though, tragically, our firstborn, Charles Jr., was kidnapped and murdered in 1932. Do you feel comfortable talking about the kidnapping? Well, yes. The man who kidnapped our son was Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant who'd been living in the United States for several years. He was a carpenter by trade, but he had a criminal history. He had been involved in petty theft and had previous convictions for robbery. He was the one who, along with an accomplice, built the ladder that was used to snatch our son from his crib that night in 1932. At first, we held on to hope that our son would be returned to us safely. We followed the instructions of the kidnappers, paying the ransom, $50,000. But, tragically, despite the ransom being paid, our son's body was found just a few weeks later. It was one of the darkest moments in our life, and it was clear that he had been taken from us with no mercy. After a lengthy investigation, Hauptmann was arrested. There was overwhelming evidence that he was the one behind the crime. Fingerprints on the ransom note, some of the ransom money found in his possession, and other pieces of evidence. Hauptmann insisted he was innocent, claiming that he had come into possession of the ransom money for another person, but the evidence was clear. In 1935, Hauptmann was convicted of kidnapping and murder. He was sentenced to death. His execution took place in 1936, and it was a grim conclusion to an already heartbreaking chapter of our lives. That was a harrowing time. How did you and Anne cope with the loss and the aftermath of the trial? It was a time of intense media attention and public scrutiny, which was something we weren't prepared for. The loss of our son was devastating, and the media circus made it all the more difficult. We withdrew from public life, seeking peace and privacy in the years that followed. It was the kind of experience that changes everything, and I often wished it had never happened. But it did, and we had to find a way to live with it. It was an unimaginable ordeal. The media frenzy and the public scrutiny compounded our grief. We withdrew from public life, moving to Europe for several years. It took time, but we focused on raising our other children and rebuilding a sense of normalcy. How did that event shape your later years? It made me wary of fame and its consequences. I became deeply interested in science, conservation, and privacy. I worked on advancing aviation technology through World War II and championed environmental causes, particularly in preserving wildlife. Well then, what was retirement like for you? Retirement was never about complete withdrawing. I spent my later years writing, traveling, and advocating for conservation. I found peace in nature, particularly in Hawaii. Mr. Lindbergh, thank you for sharing your incredible life story with us. Thank you. It's been a privilege to reflect on my journey. Charles Lindbergh spent his last years on Maui in his small, rustic seaside home. In 1972, he became sick with cancer and ultimately died of lymphoma on the morning of August 26, 1974, at age 72. After his cancer diagnosis, Lindbergh sketched a simple design for his grave and coffin, helping to design his grave in the traditional Hawaiian style. Following a series of radiation treatments, he spent several months in Maui recuperating, and also made a 26-day stay in the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York, but with little improvement. After he realized the treatment would not save him, he decided to leave Columbia Hospital and return to Kipahulu with his wife Anne, flying to Honolulu on August 17th and then traveling to Maui by small plane, dying a week later. He was buried on the grounds of the Palapala Church in Kipahulu, Maui, a congregational church first established in 1864, which fell into disuse in the 1940s and was restored beginning in 1964 by Samuel F. Pryor, Jr., whose family cooperated with the Lindbergh family to create an endowment for the upkeep of the property. Lindbergh took part in the church restoration with his old friend Pryor, and both men agreed to make their final resting place in the small cemetery they cleared. And now, another forgotten history. In 1926, Lufthansa introduced its first-class service in a way that was elegant, and it was groundbreaking. A flight attendant, dressed in a crisp uniform, helped a lady step into a sleek Fokker-Grulich F-11, one of the early aircrafts that would define the golden age of air travel. Known then as Lufthansa, the airline was among the first to offer a luxurious experience in the sky, setting the bar for future generations of air travel. Passengers were treated to comfort and exclusivity, with attendants offering personalized service during the time when flying was still a rare and somewhat thrilling adventure for the elite. The plane itself was a marvel of engineering for its time. A twin-engine monoplane, it could carry up to 10 passengers, offering more space and smoother flights than many of its contemporaries. Lufthansa's move to integrate business class-like amenities to their offerings spoke volumes about the changing nature of air travel. What had once been an arduous journey taking days was now becoming more comfortable and accessible for those who could afford it. This early innovation would eventually pave the way for the sprawling, opulent airline services we have today. What started as an exclusive service for the few soon transformed the aviation industry, influencing how airlines would operate for decades. The luxury of air travel in the 1920s may seem distant, but the legacy of those early days still shapes the way we fly today. Join us Christmas week as we tell you about the connections between Jesus, St. Nicholas, and Santa Claus. We'll also tell you the story about a little girl named Virginia O'Hanlon who asked, "Is there really a Santa Claus?" Until then, take care.